Julian Vance had always seen the world through a lens of zeros and ones, a digital landscape of assets and liabilities. The news of his father's passing was not a tragedy, but an accounting entry. It was an event to be managed, a final, inconvenient transaction to close the chapter on a relationship that had been distant and cold for years. He was the king of modern media, his empire built on the swift, digital downfall of public figures. He didn't build, he acquired and dismantled. His father, Arthur Vance, had been a builder, a man who clung to the fading notion of honest journalism in a newspaper called the Chronicle, a relic from a different era. Julian's private jet touched down on a tarmac slick with the morning's rain, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled bubble of his life. The will reading was brief, a formality. The real revelation came later, in the humid air of his father's old study. The executor, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually worried frown, cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, Mr. Vance. Your father left you his newspaper." Julian's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "The Chronicle? It's a fossil. What good is a paper that no one reads?" He saw the paper not as a legacy, but as a final, cumbersome burden. He would sell the building, auction the presses, and use the meager profit to fund a new acquisition. It was a simple, clean, and logical solution. But as he prepared to walk away, a single, unassuming photograph on his father's desk caught his eye, a faded picture of a young woman with a determined gaze, her face partially obscured by the shadow of a grand, rusted bell. He didn't recognize her, or the bell, but for a moment, the cold, calculated world he inhabited seemed to recede, replaced by a ghost of a question he didn't know he had. The offices of the Chronicle were exactly as Julian had pictured them, a tomb. The air was heavy with the scent of aging paper, fading ink, and a profound silence. He expected to find dusty desks and abandoned equipment. Instead, he found a solitary figure seated at a cluttered desk in the center of the vast, empty newsroom. It was Anya Sharma, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a single desk lamp. She wasn't just working, she was a sentinel, the last guard of a fortress on the verge of collapse. Her presence was a rebuke to everything Julian stood for. He was a creature of speed, of the headline and the viral sensation. She worked with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a person who believed in the weight of every word. She looked up, her gaze steady, not with the awe or fear he was used to, but with a quiet challenge. "You're Julian Vance," she stated, her voice as calm as the morning fog. "I promised your father I would stay until the end." Julian scoffed, gesturing at the silent newsroom. "The end is here. There's nothing left to save." Anya didn't flinch. She simply turned back to her work, a single, handwritten note card. "It's not about saving the paper, Mr. Vance. It's about finishing a story your father never could." Her words hung in the stillness, not as a plea, but as a final, resonant bell tolling a truth Julian had tried to bury his entire life. Anya's quiet defiance was far more unsettling than any hostile takeover attempt. She hadn't begged, she had simply stated a fact that Julian found himself unable to ignore. He retreated to his father's private office, the door groaning shut behind him. The room was a museum of a life he had never understood. His father's dusty journals, bound in worn leather, lay stacked on the desk. Anya appeared in the doorway, a ghost of her own, holding the same faded photograph from earlier. "This was the last story your father worked on," she said, her voice softer now, more conspiratorial. "He called it The Last Bell Tolls." Julian picked up the photo, his fingers tracing the outlines of a young woman he still didn't recognize. "Who is this?" he asked, a rare note of genuine curiosity in his voice. "She was part of a story, a community project. They were building a bell tower." Julian stared at the photo. The structure in the background, a grand, stone bell tower, was completely alien to him. He remembered hearing his father talking about the bell years ago, a hushed, heated argument over a grainy phone call. He dismissed it as another one of his father's quixotic dreams. But as Anya spoke of his father's final days, of him poring over old ledgers and cryptic notes, Julian felt a strange and unwanted shift within him. A flicker of something more profound than a financial opportunity. It was the stirrings of a legacy he didn't know he had. The gleaming, black town car navigated the winding backroads, leaving Julian's modern world behind. As the last vestiges of the city vanished in the rearview mirror, Anya pointed to a dense, overgrown patch of forest. "It's in there," she said. Julian stared at the tangled overgrowth, a far cry from the pristine, manicured lawns of his estate. He felt a deep sense of unease, as if he were stepping into a different time, a different life, the one his father had secretly led. They pushed through the foliage, and there it was, the Vance Bell Tower, a crumbling ruin of stone and forgotten dreams. It wasn't majestic or grand as it had been in the photo, but a skeletal monument to a project that had been abandoned long ago. Anya explained the history as they walked the perimeter. The Vances funded it as a community project, but the money was pulled without warning. The local family, the Millers, who were building it, just disappeared. Julian's mind raced back to the faint memory of his father's argument, the words betrayal and the Millers echoing in his mind. He ran his hand along the cold stone, a sense of loss and injustice heavy in the air. He felt a pang of something more than curiosity, it was a deep, inherited guilt. And then, at the base of the tower, half hidden by a tangle of ivy, he saw it, a small, loose stone.
With a surprising surge of strength, Julian knelt and pried the stone from its resting place. It came loose with a grinding sound, revealing a small, dark hollow within the tower's base. Nestled inside, protected from the elements, was a small, worn leather-bound book. Julian's heart beat a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. This wasn't a treasure map or a secret key. This was something far more personal. As he carefully lifted it out, a cloud of dust billowed, carrying with it the smell of old paper and the ghost of a long-kept secret. He opened the book to find his father's elegant, sprawling script. It wasn't a journal, but a ledger, a meticulous record of every penny spent on the bell tower, from the cost of the stone to the wages of the masons. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the endless lines of numbers, a language he understood better than any other. But at the end, he found something that wasn't a number at all, a series of photographs tucked into the final page. One was of his father, looking younger and happier than Julian had ever seen him, standing with the young woman from the first photograph. Another was a picture of a small, bright-eyed boy, smiling with a shy, innocent confidence. He stared at the images, a cold dread creeping into his bones. His father hadn't just funded the project, he had been personally invested. This wasn't a business transaction gone wrong. It was a profound, personal betrayal. The ledger provided the first real clue. It wasn't about what was written, but what was missing. The final entry, incomplete and frantic, pointed to a sudden halt in the funding. The last name mentioned was Miller, followed by a panicked scribble and a small, crudely drawn map. "He must have left this for them," Anya whispered, her voice full of a mournful understanding. A way to find him, a way to explain. Julian stared at the map. It led not to a treasure, but to a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of the town. His mind, trained for corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers, was now focused on something entirely different, a human connection. He was no longer a vulture circling a dying asset, but a detective hunting a ghost. As they drove, the city's concrete towers gave way to rolling hills and a landscape Julian had only seen in documentaries. The journey was an uncomfortable lesson in his own ignorance. He had lived his entire life in a self-made bubble, believing his world was the only one that mattered. Anya, meanwhile, was perfectly at home here, pointing out landmarks and a sense of history he couldn't comprehend. When they finally reached the cabin, it was in better repair than the bell tower, but still deeply isolated. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. Julian felt his stomach tighten with a mix of fear and anticipation. He was about to confront the human cost of his family's legacy. He had built his empire on secrets and digital shadows. Now he was about to face a truth made of flesh and blood. The door to the cabin opened, revealing an old man with a face etched by years of hard work and quiet sorrow. It was the young boy from the photograph, his innocence now replaced by a weariness that went bone deep. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Julian felt his own rehearsed confidence crumble. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Anya introduced herself, and the man, whose name was Thomas Miller, invited them inside. The cabin was a testament to a life lived simply and with dignity. On a small mantelpiece, Julian saw a framed photograph of his father and Thomas's mother, the same woman from the faded picture, standing together, their faces lit with a shared joy. Thomas saw him looking and let out a tired sigh. "Your father was a good man," he said, the words a shock to Julian's ears. "He was my mother's friend. He promised to help us with the bell tower, a project she believed would bring our community back to life. But then he stopped coming, stopped calling. The money just stopped." Julian's father had told him it was a simple business decision, an investment that wasn't paying off. But Julian could see the truth now, in the creases around Thomas's eyes and the ache in his voice. Thomas's mother had died of a broken heart a few years later, and their family had never recovered from the public shame and financial ruin. Julian looked at the old man's face, a mirror of the innocent boy in the photo, and felt a profound sense of shame. Thomas Miller's story was a slow, painful unraveling of a truth Julian had always denied. His father had been caught between his loyalty to the Miller family and the ruthless demands of his own father, Julian's grandfather. In a cruel twist of corporate fate, the Vance family had secretly acquired the land the Millers were building on, only to pull the funding and force them out. The betrayal wasn't Arthur Vance's idea, but a cruel command he was too weak to disobey. It was a secret he had carried his entire life, a wound that had festered in the silence between him and his son. The bell tower wasn't just a failed project. It was a monument to his failure to protect the people he cared about. Julian walked out of the cabin, the fresh air doing little to clear the fog of guilt and revelation. The empire he was so proud of was built not just on zeros and ones, but on a foundation of betrayal and human suffering. The money he had so easily dismissed as meager profit from the sale of the Chronicle was the key to this man's life, and a debt his family could never repay. He looked at Anya, whose steady gaze seemed to hold no judgment, only a quiet understanding. He had a choice now, to continue his life as a king of empty headlines, or to use the very paper he had scorned to tell a story that truly mattered. A story of a lost bell tolling for a family who deserved justice. The weight of his father's name, once a badge of honor, now felt like a heavy, suffocating chain. Julian returned to his father's old office, but the space felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of a truth he could no longer ignore. He found Anya still at her desk, the single lamp casting a lonely glow. He sat across from her, the polished mahogany table now feeling less like a barrier and more like a bridge. He began to speak, the words coming out in a rush, a confession, and a plan all at once. He told her about the ledger, about the Miller family's suffering, and about the true reason his grandfather had shut the project down. He didn't offer an excuse for his father, only an explanation for the man he never truly knew. Anya listened, her expression unchanging, her silence a profound invitation to continue. When he was done, she didn't offer pity or judgment. She simply said, "So you've decided to save the paper?" Julian shook his head. "No, I've decided to finish the story." He explained his plan. They wouldn't just write a puff piece. They would use the Chronicle's resources to conduct a full, deep-dive exposé. It would be a story that exposed the dark underside of the Vance legacy, a story of an injustice that had been buried for decades. It was a financial risk, a public relations nightmare, and a complete subversion of everything he had ever done. But for the first time in his life, the risk felt right. It felt like the only choice he could make to truly free himself from the gilded cage of his name. The next weeks were a blur of work Julian had never imagined himself doing. He and Anya became a team, an unlikely pairing of a digital king and an analog queen. He learned to appreciate the slow, meticulous art of journalism, of tracking down old city records, of poring over microfiche, of the quiet, patient work that unearths a truth. They interviewed former employees who had been silenced by non-disclosure agreements, and uncovered land deeds and corporate documents that were sealed for years. They discovered a long-buried paper trail that detailed his grandfather's cunning plan to acquire the land, not for development, but for a tax loophole that earned him millions while leaving a community in ruin. For Julian, the process was a form of therapy. Every document they uncovered, every story they validated, was a piece of the puzzle that was his father's life. He began to see his father not as a distant, cold figure, but as a man caught in a terrible trap. Anya, meanwhile, saw a different side of the ruthless mogul she had only known through headlines. She saw the genuine anguish in his eyes, the unwavering focus he now brought to a cause far greater than profit. The long, silent hours in the newsroom fostered a deep, unspoken bond between them, a trust forged in the shared pursuit of a single, simple truth. When the final word was written, the last fact checked, a profound stillness settled over them. The story was complete. All that was left was to tell it. The day the Chronicle published the story felt like a shift in the very fabric of Julian's world. The headline was not sensational or clickbait-driven. It was simple, direct, and devastating: the Vance legacy, how one family's greed crushed a community. The article went viral, but not in the way Julian's other content did. There was no outrage, no vitriol. Instead, there was an outpouring of shared shock and a deep, collective sadness. The world saw the human faces behind the corporate greed, the broken lives that had been forgotten. The backlash Julian had expected from the public never came. But the corporate world was a different story. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. They were furious, their voices a cacophony of financial ruin and shareholder revolt. His rivals attempted to use the story to attack his credibility. But Julian was no longer the man who cared about their opinion. He faced them, not with a PowerPoint presentation, but with a quiet, unshakable conviction. He told them that this was the new legacy of the Vance name, a commitment to truth and to accountability. The story wasn't just a betrayal of his grandfather's secret, it was a statement of purpose. It was the first time Julian Vance had ever truly stood on his own, his convictions unburdened by the weight of a name he had inherited, but never owned. The article's impact was immediate and profound. Donations poured in for Thomas Miller and the surviving members of the community. A foundation was established to rebuild the bell tower, this time with full transparency and community involvement. Julian, using his own personal fortune, matched the donations, and over the next few months, he oversaw the construction of the tower, every day a quiet, humble act of restitution. The gleaming, new bell was cast with a simple inscription, "In memory of what was lost." The dedication ceremony was a small, intimate affair. Julian stood beside Anya and Thomas, the three of them united not by blood or wealth, but by a shared belief in truth and redemption. The new bell was a mirror of the past, but its sound was different. When it rang, it was not the muffled, defeated sound of a forgotten dream. It was a clear, triumphant toll, a sound of healing and hope. Julian looked at Anya, whose face was illuminated by a quiet pride, and felt a profound sense of peace he had never known. The bell tolled, not for what was lost, but for what was found. And in that moment, in the gentle ringing of the bell, Julian Vance finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him. A legacy wasn't built on money or power, but on the enduring echo of a good, true story.